Ukraine's counteroffensive could shape world politics for decades. If Ukraine liberates all territory under Russian occupation, Putin could fall. If Ukraine fails, she could lose Western support. On the line is Europe's security and the preeminent role of the West in global politics. Why is the counteroffensive such a big deal? Does Ukraine have the right strategic goals? What's Putin's game plan? What should the West, whose response so far has been unproactive and confused, do now? Ukraine's theory of victory is ambitious and even frightening to Western policymakers. It may entail regime change in Moscow. It means pushing toward the Sea of Azov, breaking the Russian land bridge to Crimea and cutting off supply lines to Crimea. Ukraine's theory of victory says, if we head for Crimea, even if we don't take it, that may still prove existential for the Kremlin. And the Ukrainians are right. Crimea has both ordinary and extraordinary meaning for the Kremlin. Crimea is an ineliminable part of Russia's imperial self-image, the way, say, Belgorod actually isn't. But how does this lead to victory? First, getting to Crimea may require a morale-mediated Russian military collapse. And the Russian army does have an insoluble morale problem. Russia's army reflects the fatalism and despair of life in small Russian towns. And Russian soldiers don't really know why they're there. They feel the war is existential for them, but not for Russia. And Russia's extraordinary devolution of its monopoly over organized violence means some of these soldiers don't know who they're fighting for and who they represent. Second, Ukraine's theory of victory requires that the imminent prospect of losing Crimea will lead to regime change in Moscow. Now, why is that step necessary for Ukraine? It's necessary because if Putin survives losing Crimea, which would be difficult for him to do, he will not stop fighting the war. This is really important to understand. It's an illusion to think that if Putin loses Crimea, he'll stop fighting. This is not a tennis match in which getting back Crimea is like completing a set for Ukraine. If Putin loses and he gets thrown out of the tennis court, he'll still be in the car park throwing in rocks and hoping to try again and recapture Crimea in 2028. So anything less than an extraordinary military overachievement by Ukraine, leading to a dissolution of regime cohesion in Moscow, is likely to keep the war going and open the door for Putin's theory of victory, to which we now turn. Putin knows that the West is unconditionally committed to Ukraine's survival, but only partially committed to a full Ukrainian victory. He wants to exploit our partial commitment to a Ukrainian victory to hold on until our unconditional commitment to Ukraine's survival goes away. Commentators I admire say that Putin won't stop until he realizes that the war is a mistake. But I think he can't stop. His conviction that he is right is consolidated, not weakened, by military defeats. Putin's pre-war aims, all of Ukraine, dominance over Eastern Europe, and the collapse of NATO, remain fully in place. He won't and can't give them up, however implausible they might seem. What allows him to remain so committed is a dogmatic faith in the irreversible decline of the West. He doesn't just think that our democracies are fragile and they'll be increasingly in crisis, which is true. He thinks a kind of Hegelianism in reverse. He thinks there is a kind of historical force working against Western democracy and making its decline imminent and inevitable. When that happens, when a number of Viktor Orbáns run major Western powers, Putin thinks Eastern Europe could again come to be under Russia's umbrella. This is a serious challenge to us in the West, and it's our response that we must now scrutinize. So here is the issue. Since the beginning of Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine, we've been in an odd dynamic. Ukraine fights and we pay with cash, supplies, support, and very hesitantly, weapons. Actually, we've not just been hesitant because of nuclear risk, we've also been confused about what we want. And as a result, we've been reactive and not proactive.
Ongoing pleas for help.
That is a level of help that President Biden has not been prepared to grant.
It boils down to this. Western policymakers are committed to Ukraine not losing, but they're not committed to a full Ukrainian victory. Because they worry it might cause World War III, or a collapsed state in Russia, or a leader worse than Putin in the Kremlin. But it's more complex than that, because we live in democracies. And inevitably, to get Western electorates to keep supporting Ukraine, Western leaders need to keep showing them successes on the battlefield. This is what we paid for, and this is what we got. And that's the bizarre logic we are stuck in. The more Ukraine succeeds, the more we'll be prepared to support her, the more we'll be prepared to pay. Which means that what happens on the battlefield shapes our strategy, instead of our strategy shaping what happens on the battlefield. We can't get rid of that conundrum unless we get rid of democracy, but we can do better with it, and here is what we need to do. A wait-and-see approach won't do. We can't just sit back spectatorially and hope that the counteroffensive is the last battle of the war. We need to plan for what comes after. We need our own theory of victory that's workable no matter what results Ukraine's counteroffensive yields. We need to indicate that we're committed for the long term. If needed, we'll back Ukraine for years and will support future Ukrainian counteroffensives, no matter what results this one yields. We need to provide security guarantees for Ukraine, and unlike what we did in 1994, we need to make the next ones real. And we need to be mature about balancing nuclear risk, which, if Putin's on the verge of losing Crimea, may be higher than at any point in history. The illusion here is to think that there is a way forward without nuclear risk. We could reduce nuclear risk in the short term by telling the world that we won't support Ukraine taking Crimea. But given Putin's intent and given the gearing of the Russian state toward future escalation against the West, we may just be exchanging nuclear risk today for nuclear risk tomorrow or later in the 2020s. That Crimea should be a hot point for such escalation is in part a product of Russia's extraordinary Crimea myth. To understand why that myth is at the heart of Russia's imperial self-image and to see how Putin stoked it 2014 onwards, watch this video next.